So I've talked about all the benefits of the RPO and how we can help and get you in the best possible position for getting certified. But what does the certification process look like? And lucky for you, we have Srini to talk about what the C3PAO is going to do in the engagement. And I'll hand it off to Srini to describe that for us.
Sure, Greg. Definitely, I'll be happy to go over that. So the good news is, 75, in my opinion, about 70 to 75% of the heavy lifting needs to be done by the RPOs and the OSCs, organizations seeking certifications, right? And then our job is essentially to come in and make sure you are meeting the requirements published by CyberAB and endorsed by DoD. So CyberAB, working with DoD, they published about 5 or 6 critical guides. One of them is CAP. You probably listened to Greg, and he referred CAP a lot during his presentation. So that is CAP stands for CMMC assessment process, right? So that's like kind of our Bible. That's what we are going to follow to make sure we follow each one of the bullet points that are listed in there. You all have access to it, and they are trying to create a very, very transparent approach to this whole certification process. And worst case scenario, if you don't agree with us in terms of our assessment, right, you could appeal the whole process. If you understand the whole the CAP process and stuff, then like you could appeal, go and appeal to DoD directly in terms of the way it works. All of the things that we are going to be doing as C3PAO, that's all going to be recorded. That's what Greg was alluding to in his acronym list, EMAS, which stands for the Enterprise, I think it stands for the Enterprise Assessment, Enterprise Assessment and Assurance System, right, management system. So that's where like all of the information that we are collecting from you as OSC and as assessor, we are going to be collecting and then uploading it into EMAS, which is managed by the DoD group. In phase 1, at a very high level, again, it goes based on the planning and then the actual assessment, and then closing out the assessment, which is phase 3, and then pretty much wrapping up everything, right? That's how the 4 phases are created. Phase 1 technically could range from 1 to several days. Also, there is a concept of this limited practice deficiency correction, which I think as OSC, you all need to be aware of it. What CyberAB and DoD allows us to do is there are about 15 or so controls within that 800-171 that are allowed to be in this category. What it essentially means is you will have about 5 days, technically 5 days, even after our assessment. Let's say we identify a few issues. For example, your architecture diagram is not updated, and it's not reflecting properly in terms of the items that need to be in their assets and the user base and whatnot of the sites, right? Or like it could be some of your documentation and the approvals are not in there, or like some of the sections are missing and stuff. Those kind of things is what are packaged under the limited practice deficiency correction, which you will have as OSC about 5 days to correct. And that will allow you to basically, the way they're working is like, if you go back to the earlier slide one more time, please, I'll quickly go over some of the key things that OSC need to be aware of, right? So essentially everything is started from OSC. Let's say it's an organization, right? OSC, they kind of keep it complicated, but you're the company, you're the organization seeking certification. So you kind of initiate that. You go to CMMC Marketplace, identify a C3PAO and say, hey, I want to go through the certification process. We think we are ready. We think we've done the 75% of all the work that needs to be done, the self-assessment, engaging our PO, and making sure that all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and whatnot, like have identified the boundaries of the system, the entire assets, and the interfaces and whatnots, and then you documented everything. Going back to Greg's point, you have your SSPs, and you have gone through each one of them. So essentially, we as C3PAO, we are not doing anything magical, right? Essentially, our guide is 800, 171, 171A. That's what we are going to go through. So all we are going to be doing is examine, observe, and test. Examine, observe, and test. Examine, observe, and test. That's all we are going to do. And depending on what kind of controls are applicable for your environment. So we are going to say at the end of the day, whether you're meeting the requirement, not meeting the requirement, or that requirement is not applicable. These are the only three options we have as assessor. So one of the three options we will select, and then we need to essentially justify why we are saying you're meeting that control requirement, and we need to justify why you are not meeting the control requirement and why it is not applicable, right? So all of them requires very detailed explanation of each one of them, right? And also one important thing for you to know is there is a portion of controls that we need to do in-person audit, right? So it majority of the thing could be a virtual audit, but there are CMMC as per their cap, they have specifically called out about 15 to 20 controls that requires in-person audit. What the examples of some of those controls, as you could imagine, these are like physical security controls. I cannot remotely see how is your physical security set up, whether your disposal processes are all meeting all the requirements of 800 171, and the way like you allow the visitor logs, escorting them and whatnot. Those are like some of the control that requires in-person thing. So essentially when you engage a C3PAO, there is going to be two components. One is the virtual, and then the second one is in person, right? In terms of conducting the audit, pretty straightforward process. You're going to kick off. Even before kicking off, we are going to primarily be spending a lot of time with the organization OSCs to identify, what is the real scope of what we are going to be auditing. That is, they are spending and elaborating that particular section a lot. It is relatively new, as you all could imagine. CMMC is relatively new, but they are spending a lot of time in terms of making sure everyone engaged in this project, right? Like whether it's C3PAO, RPO, or OSC, and even Cyber AB and DoD, like they understand the phase one part of it, which is scoping it, making sure that like you clearly document, plan, frame the assessment, and then identify everything, all the moving parts and stuff, and then come up with some kind of a timeline, and then complete the contract that are required, right? Then we move on to the phase two, which is, in my opinion, is the core of what we do. So this is the assessment part. So as I mentioned, examine, interview, test. Examine, interview, test. That's all we are going to be doing. And you could just Google up and then figure out 800 171A security requirements for all of the 800 171 controls. 110 controls are out there, and so they have specifically called out, say for example, just to give you an example, access control, right? Access control, they kind of break down further into what are the processes that are accessing the in-scope system, what are the users accessing the system, and how do they access it, and all the different details, line items are out there for 800 171A. Those are some of the things that we are going to go in detail. So technically, this could get very a deep dive in terms of how we are auditing the system, how we are identifying potential risk and stuff, and then like documenting all of these things, right? So third-party gap analysis, so readiness report, whatever you have already created with RPOs and things, those are like some of our input. That is something we will use to further document our assessment findings, and or like we would probably be referring some of those things as well as part of our things. There's two main things that we are going to be looking at as we are auditing, right? The adequacy and sufficiency. Those are the two things that they specifically talk about in this guide. One is does this information that is provided is the right evidence, right? Like let's say you are for access control, you're going to give your Active Directory information, and we are going to be going over all of the details and figuring out what kind of accounts are there, group accounts are there, and then what kind of automated accounts are created and stuff. And then the second thing in terms of sufficiency we are going to be looking at is Active Directory is the only access control system that you have, or do you have any other one-off system that are authorizing users and processes into your CUI and FCI data, right? That's what we are going to be looking at. And so again, like after doing all these assessments, we do have scoring guidelines again. They have a CMMC scoring with DOD assessment scoring methodology. There's a document available out there. And then the way it works is like each of the controls are the scores are assigned depending on the priorities from 1 to 5. Right, and if you are meeting the requirements, then we are going to give you some score. If you are not meeting the requirement, obviously the score is going to be 0. So at the end of the day, we can categorize some of the items or like less significant, which will be going under the limited practice deficiency, and then like we will be preparing our the preliminary findings and stuff. So anything less than 80%, that means you are technically not going to be certified, right? So that's where like you don't want to be in, and that's where I think the RPO's engagement and your pre-assessment and the readiness assessment is going to really help you to understand your environment, understand the controls better, and then make sure that they are implemented and then ready for testing and things, right? So that is how like the whole thing works. Anything less than 80%. So the way it is calculated is out of 110 controls, if you are 88 or less, if you're not meeting 88 controls, right? Then like you will be under the you will not be recommended for certification. Let's put it that way. And then if I have identified, let's say if our organization identifies a certain LPDC within your environment, again we cannot categorize all your controls under LPDC, right? So it is going to be only set of controls that CyberAB has categorized or DOD has categorized that could be considered as LPDC based on the control efficiency. Say, for example, if you don't have a FIPS validated encryption, cryptography, then it's not, I cannot put them under LPDC. So that's going to be totally separate, and that will be a straight not met requirement, right? And so there are certain things which we could put under LPDC, and you have 5 days to get them corrected. And so let's say you have an 88 score and you pass the certification, and then like you would still end up having POM, right? So plan of action and milestone for each of the controls. We are specifically going to be documenting what are the weakness, what is the scope, and what is like kind of your mitigation options, and what could be. So the one important thing or interesting thing that they also want us to quantify is the cost. What will be the approximate cost of implementing this particular control and thing, and then doing some kind of risk assessment of not having that particular control in place, right? So that will be the main thing that we will be documenting as part of our POEM. So as you could imagine, we are not the expert of your environment, OSC's environment, so we will be collaboratively working with OSCs to identify the details of the POEM and then like documenting everything that is required. Next slide, please. So once we have this whole information, then like you are ready to go. If you're going to be 80% plus, then like we are going to be recommending you for the interim certification. That's where the EMAS comes in. What we will do is like we will update all the required documents into the EMAS, the DOD site, where like they will have access to all the information. So everything that we are doing, they have visibility into it. And in fact, like we also need to attest for the COI, that is the conflict of interest, even before we start our engagement with you. So that way, like, there is no collusion between the C3PAO and the OSC to get them certified, right? So all these things are available with the DoD for their reference, right? And so if we are not, like, of course, as Greg mentioned, like if you're not 80%, if you're less than 80%, then you're going to be redoing the whole thing, right? So again, you don't want to be in there. So it is a pretty expensive affair for everybody. So what you want to do is, like, you want to, as I mentioned in the very beginning, you do all the heavy lifting well, and start with get everything done so that, like, you're ready and ready to bring in the C3PAO and get your organization certified, right? The phase 4 is pretty much the standard formality where we will be closing out all the poems after one. So you have about 180 days to close out all the poems, right? So in phase 3, what we are doing is, let's say you have a poem, then we are going to be giving you a conditional certification, right? It's not like the final certification. It will be a conditional certification, and then, like, you have up to 180 days according to poem. Then, like, you will have to engage the same C3PAO, or it could be a separate different C3PAO. They will come in and then review all our poems and close out the assessments, and that way, like, you are good to go for 3 years. So it's a 3-year cycle, right? And so you will have to get yourself certified again in the next 3 years. As I mentioned in the very beginning, for all of these processes, guides, everything is available for OSCs and general public and RPOs, C3POs, right? That's the process we are going to follow, and you do have appeal process. In case if you don't agree with our assessment, you don't agree with the process what you are following, you do have a appeal process that you could just follow to make sure that your money is well spent, right? So that's like in essence the certification. So a lot of time we get asked how long the certification process does take and stuff. It totally depends. It totally depends on the scope and how many sites we are talking about, and the complexity of the whole thing. Generally, our assessment could go from like a month to 3 months, right? And then based on our experience, at least, a lot of companies are taking anywhere from 3 to 6 months to do the implementation, do the self-assessment, the readiness with RPOs and things, and then bring in the CMMC C3PAOs to do the certification.